I am Morgan. I am 30 years old, and somehow I am still paying the price for being the family scapegoat. Last Sunday, my parents hosted their 40th anniversary dinner at our family brownstone in Brooklyn. I was sitting quietly in the corner of the living room working on my laptop. My sister-in-law Sloane strutted over and casually unplugged my computer right from the wall so she could plug in her lavender essential oil diffuser. She smirked and looked down at me. "Still playing with your little computer hobby, Morgan?" She sighed loudly so everyone in the room could hear her. "At least get a real job like us." My brother Julian laughed loudly and raised his expensive glass of wine. He then announced to the entire extended family that he was taking over the first floor of the brownstone where I lived to build a private home gym for Sloane. He told me I had until the end of the month to pack my bags and get out. I simply sipped my ice water and smiled. What they did not know was that the little computer hobby they were laughing at had just made me a billionaire. And in exactly 48 hours, I would use it to completely dismantle Julian's precious Wall Street career and leave Sloane with absolutely nothing. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who severely underestimated your worth. You will definitely want to hear exactly how this dinner ended. Growing up in a strict household meant constantly keeping up appearances. My parents, Reverend James and Patricia, cared much more about their pristine image in the local church community than they cared about my emotional well-being. From the very moment my older brother Julian was born, he was their golden child. Every single ounce of their energy, affection, and savings went into his Ivy League education and his perfect reputation. I was just the quiet, invisible girl who scavenged for discarded computer parts and taught herself how to write complex code in the middle of the night. The dining room of the historic Brooklyn brownstone was completely suffocating that evening. The warm air was thick with the smell of roasted lamb and Sloane's overwhelming lavender oil. Dozens of aunts, uncles, and finance cousins were gathered around the long, antique mahogany table. After Julian made his grand, cruel announcement about kicking me out into the street to build a gym, nobody came to my defense. Not a single person spoke up for me. My mother, Patricia, just adjusted her expensive pearl necklace and nodded eagerly. She looked at me with that familiar, heavily disappointed gaze she had perfected over 3 long decades. She said, "Julian is right, Morgan. You are 30 years old, and you still do not have a real career. Julian and Sloane are highly respected leaders in our community. Julian is a vice president of compliance at Vanguard Legacy Bank. They desperately need the extra space to unwind after doing actual important work. You should be incredibly happy to help your brother succeed." I looked across the table at my father, hoping that he might finally find the courage to speak up for his only daughter. Reverend James just cleared his throat loudly and began to butter a piece of dinner roll. He told me I should really consider applying for a basic receptionist position at Julian's investment bank. He said it would be good for me to finally contribute something meaningful to society instead of hiding behind a digital screen all day long. The sheer humiliation burned deep in my chest, but I kept my face perfectly neutral and calm. Sloane walked gracefully back over to the large table and took her designated seat right next to Julian. She smoothed down the fabric of her overpriced silk dress and gave me a disgusting, pitying look. It was the exact kind of look someone gives a helpless stray dog on the street. She said, "I know change is really hard, Morgan, but we are truly doing this for your own good. You cannot just leech off the family estate forever. Maybe struggling to pay rent will finally motivate you to do something productive with your adult life." The finance cousins chuckled quietly into their napkins. They were all wearing tailored, expensive suits and whispering about their massive investment portfolios. Julian leaned far back in his sturdy chair and swirled his expensive red wine. He looked at me with absolute pure disgust. He said, "I will even be generous to you, Morgan. I will give you exactly $500 to help cover the cost of the moving truck. Consider it a charitable donation from us." The entire room erupted into polite, supportive laughter once again. They were all so incredibly comfortable disrespecting me in my own childhood home. They thought I was completely powerless and weak. They thought I was just a sad, unemployed woman playing silly games on a cheap laptop. They had absolutely no idea that I was the stealth founder and chief executive officer of Nexus AI. My secretive company had just developed the most advanced compliance and data security algorithm in the entire world. I was not playing games. I was running a massive tech empire that was currently valued at over $3 billion. I slowly closed the heavy lid of my dead laptop. The battery had died the exact moment Sloane selfishly unplugged it from the wall. I looked directly into Julian's arrogant brown eyes. I told him I did not need his pathetic $500. I told him I was perfectly comfortable right where I was. Julian slammed his heavy hand down hard on the table, making the silver cutlery rattle loudly against the fine china. His face turned bright red with sudden rage. He told me I did not have a choice in the matter. He said he was the man of the family and the primary breadwinner. He proudly claimed he was carrying the heavy legacy of the Evans family on his back, while I was a massive embarrassment to our good name. He aggressively demanded that I show him some proper respect immediately. Sloane quickly rested her pale hand on Julian's arm to gently calm him down. She looked at me and intentionally used that soft, condescending voice she always weaponized against me in public. She said, "Morgan, we are not trying to be cruel to you. I just genuinely think you lack ambition and drive. I mean, just look at the incredible things Julian has achieved for himself. He is breaking major barriers on Wall Street. He is a shining example for young black men everywhere in the city. What are you doing with your time? You just sit in that dark room downstairs staring at a monitor. It is honestly very depressing to witness. I even offered to introduce you to my personal trainer to help you get out of your sad funk. I am just trying to lift you up to our level." Her calculated words were exactly like toxic venom wrapped in sweet honey. She absolutely loved playing the gracious white savior while simultaneously tearing my confidence down to nothing. She loved reminding everyone in the room that she brought old generational wealth and elite connections to our family, while I supposedly brought absolutely nothing of value. I sat there silently absorbing every single insult, every patronizing sigh, and every condescending laugh from my relatives. The intense anger I felt inside was deep and freezing cold. It was not the explosive kind of anger that makes you scream and throw things. It was the dangerous kind of anger that makes you incredibly patient. I calmly picked up my crystal water glass and took a very slow, refreshing sip. The large antique grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, echoing in the sudden quiet of the dining room. It was exactly 8:15 in the evening. I knew the precise time because I had been silently counting down the minutes in my head all night. I knew a massive secret that they did not. I knew that the major global business news outlets always released their evening digital editions right at 8:15 sharp. I looked at Julian and then I looked at Sloane with a genuine smile. I told them they might want to check their cell phones before they started picking out paint colors for their new home gym. Julian scoffed loudly and asked why he would care about his phone when he was busy dealing with a stubborn, ungrateful child. But before he could even finish his arrogant sentence, his phone suddenly buzzed. Then another phone buzzed. And another. Within 5 seconds, a chorus of custom ringtones and sharp notification chimes erupted all around the long mahogany table. Julian pulled his phone from his tailored suit pocket with a heavy sigh. He was clearly annoyed by the sudden interruption to his grand speech. I watched his brown eyes dart across the bright screen. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered on his face all evening completely vanished in less than a second. His tanned skin turned a sickly shade of gray. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Sloane reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her own phone. She gasped so loudly it echoed off the high ceilings. The heavy silver fork she was holding slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered loudly against her fine china plate. Down the table, my cousin Marcus and his fellow finance brothers were all staring at their screens in absolute stunned silence. My mother, Patricia, looked around the room in pure confusion. She asked Julian what was going on and why everyone was acting so strangely. Julian slowly looked up from his screen and stared at me. It was the very first time in my entire 30 years of life that he looked at me with genuine fear. His voice was barely a whisper when he finally managed to speak. He asked me what this was. He asked me if this was some kind of sick, elaborate joke. I did not say a single word. I just sat back in my chair and let the heavy silence do the talking for me. My father. Reverend James leaned over and snatched the phone out of Julian's trembling hand. He put on his reading glasses and looked closely at the glowing screen. I knew exactly what he was looking at. It was the digital front page of Bloomberg News, right next to the new cover of Time magazine. Right there in stunning high definition was a professional portrait of me. I was wearing a sharp tailored blazer, standing in a sleek Silicon Valley office with my arms crossed and a confident smile on my face. My father read the massive bold headline out loud, and his deep voice shook with every single syllable. He read tech's newest billionaire, the secret genius revolutionizing artificial intelligence. Morgan Evans steps out of the shadows. The word billionaire hung in the dining room air like a heavy physical weight. My mother let out a small, weak cry and covered her mouth with both hands. The cousins who had just been laughing at my expense were now staring at me like I was a completely different human being. The entire power dynamic of the room had shifted in less than a minute. Sloane aggressively tapped her manicured nails against her phone screen. She was desperately trying to refresh the page as if she could somehow make the article disappear. She started shaking her head frantically. She said, "This is impossible. This has to be fake news or some sort of promotional scam." She looked around the table, pleading for someone to agree with her. She said Morgan does not even have a real job. She just fixes broken hard drives in the basement. There is no way she is running a tech empire. One of the finance cousins cleared his throat nervously. He looked at Sloane and said, "It is not fake." He told the entire table that the financial markets had been buzzing all week about a mysterious founder behind the software company Nexus Artificial Intelligence. He said the company had just closed a massive funding round and secured exclusive government contracts, making the sole founder an instant billionaire. He looked directly at me and swallowed hard. He said the founder is her. Morgan is the sole owner. It is all completely verified by the Federal Trade Commission. The silence that followed was incredibly sweet. It was the kind of absolute terrified silence that completely validates years of quiet suffering. All of the patronizing advice, the cruel jokes, and the thinly veiled insults they had thrown at me were suddenly crushed under the massive weight of undeniable success. I looked at Julian, who was still gripping the edge of the mahogany table like he was going to pass out. I asked him softly if he still wanted to give me that $500 charitable donation for a moving truck. I asked him if he still thought I needed to apply for a basic receptionist position at his bank to finally make something of myself. Julian swallowed hard. His arrogant posture had completely collapsed. He stammered and struggled to form a coherent sentence. He said, "Morgan, I do not understand. How could you hide something like this from your own family? We are your blood. Why did you not tell us?" I smiled at his sudden, desperate attempt to claim me as family. I told him I did not hide anything. I told him I was simply working hard while they were busy deciding how to tear me down. I reminded him that just 10 minutes ago he had announced he was throwing me out of my home to build a home gym for his wife. Sloane tried to recover her shattered composure. She forced a painfully fake smile that did not reach her panicked eyes. She said, "Morgan, darling, you know we were only joking about the gym. We just want what is best for you. We always knew you had incredible potential. We were simply trying to give you a little tough love to push you forward." I felt sick listening to her pathetic lies. I looked at my mother, who was now staring at me with a terrifying, greedy glint in her eyes. The heavy disappointment she had worn on her face for decades was instantly replaced by a calculating, hungry expression. I told Sloane to drop the act immediately. I told her the tough love excuse was completely transparent and deeply embarrassing. My father tried to take control of the rapidly deteriorating situation. He used his booming preacher voice and told everyone to calm down. He said, "This is a moment of immense blessing for the Evans family." He said, "The Lord has finally rewarded our household." He looked at me with a wide, artificial smile and told me how proud he was of my achievements. I felt a deep wave of nausea wash over me. For 30 years, I had practically begged for just a fraction of that pride. I had craved their approval more than anything else in the world. Now they were suddenly showering me with praise only because there were 9 zeros attached to my name. It was disgusting. Julian suddenly stood up from his chair. The initial shock was slowly wearing off, and his natural toxic entitlement was creeping back into his voice. He pointed a trembling finger at me. He said, "You owe this family everything, Morgan. You grew up under this roof. You used my old computers to learn how to code. This massive success is not just yours. We are a family and we share our blessings." I calmly folded my linen napkin and placed it neatly next to my untouched dinner plate. I looked at the people who shared my DNA and realized I felt absolutely nothing for them anymore. They were complete strangers blinded by their own selfish greed. I told Julian that my success belonged exclusively to me, and the countless sleepless nights I spent building an empire from absolutely nothing. I told him that while he was busy kissing up to bank executives and Sloan was busy looking down on everyone else, I was quietly securing my absolute freedom. The dining room that had been a prison of expectations, my entire life suddenly felt incredibly small and insignificant. I was no longer the invisible little sister waiting for crumbs of affection. I was the architect of my own destiny, and they were absolutely terrified of the massive power I now held. Julian took a heavy step toward me, and his face twisted into a dark, ugly scowl. He told me I was not going to disrespect him in front of the entire family. He said he would not let some lucky break turn me into an arrogant monster. I stood up from my chair and smoothed out my clothes. I looked Julian dead in the eye and told him I was not lucky. I was prepared. Sloane let out a loud, shrill laugh that suddenly shattered the heavy tension in the dining room. She waved her pale hand dismissively at the glowing phone screens scattered across the table. She said, "Oh, please, everyone, let us be realistic here for just a second. Do we really believe that little Morgan built a $3 billion technology company all by herself?" She looked around the table, desperately trying to rally the family back to her side and restore the natural order of things. She said, "You all know exactly how these modern tech companies work nowadays. They are completely desperate for good public relations. They constantly need a diverse face to put on the cover of their magazines to satisfy the liberal media. I bet some wealthy white guy from Silicon Valley actually wrote all the code and built the entire algorithm from scratch. They just hired Morgan to be their little diversity mascot because having a black female founder looks incredibly good for their corporate image." The collective sigh of relief from my parents was absolutely sickening to witness. My mother, Patricia, let out a long breath and nodded her head in eager agreement. She smoothed down her dress and said, "That makes perfect sense, Sloane. I knew there had to be a perfectly logical explanation for all of this nonsense. Morgan has never had the discipline or the intelligence to run a real business." Julian immediately relaxed his tense shoulders and leaned far back into his chair. The terrifying reality that his little sister was vastly more successful than him had been temporarily neutralized by his wife and her toxic racist logic. He picked up his wineglass again and the arrogant smirk slowly returned to his face. Listening to Sloane casually reduce my entire life of grueling hard work to a cheap diversity stunt made my blood run entirely cold. It was the exact same oppressive narrative I had been fighting against my entire life under this very roof. My mind was instantly pulled back to a rainy Tuesday afternoon exactly 15 years ago. I was 15 years old, and Julian was 20. My parents had called a mandatory family meeting in the living room. My father, Reverend James, proudly announced that he was taking out a massive second mortgage on our family brownstone and entirely emptying his retirement savings account. Every single penny they had managed to save over their entire lives was going straight to Julian so he could attend an elite Ivy League university without carrying a single dollar of student debt. My mother had even purchased him a brand new luxury sedan so he could look the part of a highly successful young man on his new college campus. I clearly remember standing nervously in the corner of the living room that day. I quietly asked my parents if they could possibly spare just $300 so I could buy a cheap refurbished desktop computer. I had been reading thick textbooks from the public library about software programming, and I desperately wanted to practice writing my own code. My mother looked at me like I had just asked her to set the entire house on fire. She coldly told me to stop being so incredibly selfish. She said Julian was the absolute future of the Evans family, and all of our limited resources needed to go directly toward his inevitable success. She told me I could just use the slow, outdated computers at the public library if I really wanted to play around with silly technology games. So that is exactly what I did. While Julian was attending expensive fraternity parties and networking with wealthy heirs at his Ivy League school, I was taking the city bus to the local electronics recycling center every single weekend. I would spend hours digging through massive dirty bins of discarded electronics. I carefully collected broken motherboards, cracked monitors, and fried hard drives that other people had thrown away. I brought them all back to my tiny bedroom on the first floor and spent countless sleepless nights figuring out how to piece them together. I built my very first computer out of literal garbage. I taught myself complex programming languages in the dark while my entire family slept peacefully upstairs, comfortably believing that I would never amount to anything in my life. The sudden sound of Julian pouring himself another glass of wine pulled me sharply back to the present moment. He was laughing softly again, completely restored by the comfortable lies his wife had just spun for him. He looked at me and said, "It really is a cute little setup you have going on, Morgan." He asked me how much my corporate bosses were paying me to smile for the magazine cameras and pretend to be a tech genius. He said it must be a pretty nice paycheck if they are willing to put your face on the cover of Time magazine. I did not yell or raise my voice. I just stood there and looked at the pathetic group of people sitting around the dining table. I looked at Sloane, who was sitting up perfectly straight, with a smug, satisfied look on her face. I told Sloane that her ignorance was almost as impressive as her deep-rooted insecurity. I told her there was no secret white man hiding behind a curtain pulling the strings of my company. I told her I was the sole founder and the sole owner of the business. I wrote every single line of the foundational code myself while sitting in the exact same basement room they were currently trying to kick me out of. I looked over at my mother, whose face had suddenly dropped again. I told her that the garbage computer I built from the scrapyard 15 years ago was the very same machine I used to write the first draft of the Nexus artificial intelligence algorithm. I told them that my software was now independently securing the financial data of the largest banking institutions in the entire world. Sloane aggressively rolled her eyes and crossed her arms tightly over her chest. She said, "You can spin whatever fake fairy tale you want, Morgan. But nobody in the real world is ever going to believe that a college dropout from Brooklyn completely outsmarted the greatest engineering minds in Silicon Valley. You are just riding on the coattails of people who are actually intelligent and driven. You are a complete fraud, and it is only a matter of time before everyone in the industry finds out the truth." I took a slow, deep breath. The sheer amount of mental gymnastics they were willing to do just to avoid giving me any basic credit was truly fascinating to watch. They would honestly rather believe a massive corporate conspiracy theory than admit that the family scapegoat had completely surpassed them in every possible metric of success. I walked slowly around the edge of the large dining table. I stopped right behind Julian's expensive leather chair. I placed my hand gently on the wooden backrest and leaned down just slightly so he could hear me perfectly clear. I told Julian that it did not matter if he or his wife believed the article. I told him the federal government believed it. The entire banking industry believed it. And most importantly, his senior bosses at Vanguard Legacy Bank absolutely believed it. Julian frantically grabbed his phone off the dining table. He completely ignored my factual statement about his senior bosses. His fingers were trembling uncontrollably as he rapidly typed the name of my company into his internet search browser. The large dining room was so incredibly quiet that you could clearly hear the soft, rapid tapping of his thumbs against the glass screen. Sloane quickly leaned over his broad shoulder. Her blonde hair brushed against the fabric of his tailored suit. Her pale blue eyes widened dramatically as the financial search results loaded on the bright screen. She gasped loudly again, but this time it was not out of shock or disbelief. It was out of pure, unadulterated greed. Julian stared at the digital screen for what felt like an absolute eternity. His breathing became very heavy and shallow, echoing in the silent room. He read the financial summary out loud, and his voice was completely devoid of its usual arrogant and commanding tone. He read the words, $3 billion. He whispered that Nexus Artificial Intelligence was recently valued at $3 billion after securing massive federal government contracts. He slowly dropped his phone back onto the table. The heavy metal device made a loud thud against the thick mahogany wood. He looked at me, and the expression on his face had completely transformed in a matter of seconds. The defensive anger and the cruel mocking were entirely gone. In their place was a sickening level of toxic entitlement. Julian slowly stood up from his leather chair. He ran a shaking hand through his dark hair and suddenly smiled at me. It was the most terrifying and manipulative smile I had ever seen in my entire life. He took a slow step toward me, and his voice was suddenly dripping with fake warmth and brotherly affection. He said, "Morgan, you really did it. You actually built an empire all by yourself. I am so incredibly proud of you, little sister. I always knew you had this amazing hidden potential locked away inside of you." I did not say a single word in response. I just stood there and watched him pivot from a cruel bully to a supportive, loving brother in less than 10 seconds. Sloane immediately caught on to his sudden change in strategy. She eagerly stood up and walked around the heavy table, clapping her manicured hands together like an excited little child. She said, "Oh my goodness, Morgan, this is absolutely wonderful news for our entire family. We are going to be so incredibly wealthy. We can finally buy that massive summer estate in the Hamptons we have been looking at." The sheer audacity of her statement made me feel physically sick to my stomach. She had just spent the entire evening telling me to pack my bags and move out of my childhood home because I was a useless burden. Now she was suddenly spending my hard-earned money on a luxury summer estate for herself. I looked directly at Sloane and asked her exactly who she meant when she used the word we. Julian quickly stepped between us to protect his greedy wife. His fake, warm smile faltered just a little bit, but he quickly recovered his false composure. He said, "Morgan, let us not be selfish right now in this beautiful moment. This is a massive victory for our legacy. And as the head of this family, I think it is time we sit down and discuss the business arrangement." He crossed his arms over his chest and looked at me with absolute blind confidence. He said, "You know as well as I do that you did not build this massive tech company entirely on your own." I raised an eyebrow and waited in absolute silence for him to elaborate on his delusional claim. Julian cleared his throat and projected his deep voice so the entire room of relatives could hear his ridiculous speech. He said, 10 years ago, when you were still a struggling, confused teenager, I gave you a laptop. It was a top-of-the-line machine that I paid for, with my own hard-earned money. I handed it to you because I deeply believed in your little computer hobby when nobody else did. That specific machine was the foundational tool you used to learn how to write code. It was the exact machine you used to write the original software algorithms for Nexus." I stared at him in complete and utter disbelief. The level of gaslighting was truly astronomical. I calmly told him that the laptop he was talking about was a broken piece of garbage that he had ruined by spilling an entire cup of sticky soda over the keyboard. He had thrown it into the outside trash can because the internal motherboard was completely fried and useless. I reminded him that I had dug that laptop out of the literal garbage in the rain. I had spent 3 weeks carefully cleaning the internal components with rubbing alcohol and replacing the burnt-out wires just so I could manage to turn it on. He did not generously give it to me. He discarded it like trash, just like he always discarded me. Julian aggressively waved his large hand in the air, completely dismissing my factual correction, like it meant absolutely nothing. He said the physical condition of the machine is entirely irrelevant, Morgan. The legal fact remains that it was my personal property. I provided you with the essential hardware you desperately needed to start your business venture. In the corporate finance world, that is legally classified as an angel investment. I provided the initial seed capital for your artificial intelligence company. Therefore, I am legally entitled to a massive portion of the equity. The entire dining room fell completely silent again. My cousins were staring at Julian with their mouths hanging wide open. Even they could not believe the absolute ridiculousness of his legal claim over my company. But Julian was completely serious. The promise of $1 billion payday had entirely blinded him to reality and basic common sense. He leaned forward and slammed both of his heavy hands flat on the dining table, making the plates rattle. He looked me dead in the eyes and made his formal demand right there in front of everyone. He said, "I want 50% Morgan. I want 50% ownership of the entire company and a guaranteed permanent seat on your board of directors. It is only fair considering I am the very person who built your foundation. Without my broken laptop, you would still be absolutely nothing." The room waited for my reaction. My mother, Patricia, suddenly chimed in from the end of the table. Her voice filled with desperate greed. She said, "Your brother is completely right, Morgan. Family always shares their wealth. You owe him this 50% for everything he has done for you. You need to be a good sister and sign whatever papers he needs you to sign." My father, Reverend James, nodded his head in agreement. He told me that God had blessed me with this massive fortune so that I could elevate the entire family. He said that giving Julian half of my company was the righteous and holy thing to do. They were all staring at me like a pack of hungry wolves surrounding their next meal. They had spent 30 years starving me of love, and now they wanted to feast on my success. I stood there, letting their greedy words echo in the silent room. My mother, Patricia, suddenly burst into loud theatrical tears. She covered her face with her manicured hands and began to sob dramatically. She peeked through her fingers to make sure everyone was watching her grand performance. She said, "Oh, Morgan, you have no idea how much pressure your poor brother is under right now." She wiped away a completely invisible tear and reached across the table toward me. She said, "Julian recently signed a massive mortgage for a breathtaking new estate in the Hamptons. He needs to maintain a certain luxurious lifestyle to keep his powerful position at the bank and impress his wealthy clients." She looked at me with wild, desperate eyes that completely betrayed her fake sadness. She told me I needed to wire $10 million into his bank account first thing tomorrow morning. She said it was the absolute minimum I could do to preserve the family blessing and protect our good name in the church community. I looked from my crying mother to my father. Reverend James stood up tall and puffed out his chest, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me, just like he did when I was a little girl. He told me that God commanded children to honor their parents and support their siblings unconditionally. He said the Lord gave me this sudden influx of money, specifically so I could serve Julian and elevate the Evans family legacy. He demanded that I stop being a stubborn, rebellious child and submit to my older brother just like the good book teaches. The sheer level of absolute delusion in that dining room was suffocating. They genuinely believed they could abuse me and ignore me for 30 entire years, and then casually demand $10 million like they were simply asking me to pass the salt. I slowly shook my head side to side. I looked my mother dead in the eyes and told her that her fake tears were absolutely pathetic and embarrassing. The entire room gasped loudly in unison. I told her she never shed a single tear when I was eating cheap ramen noodles in a freezing basement just to survive while they were eating expensive steaks upstairs. I told her she never cried when Julian maliciously threw my personal belongings out into the rain, or when Sloane humiliated me in front of our entire church congregation last Easter. I told her my bank accounts were permanently closed to her and the rest of this toxic parasitic family. Julian slammed his fist on the mahogany table again, making the wine glasses jump and spill dark red liquid across the pristine white tablecloth. He yelled that I was an ungrateful, selfish brat who did not understand how the real world worked. He told me I was absolutely nothing without the Evans family name backing me up. Sloane immediately chimed in, saying I was going to hell for turning my back on my own blood in their time of desperate need. She told me I was a horrible, vicious woman who only cared about money. The cousins who had just been asking me for exclusive investment advice a few moments ago were now suddenly shouting angry insults and calling me a traitor to my own people. The delicate mask of a polite high society family dinner had completely fallen off and shattered on the floor. They were finally showing me their true, ugly faces, and it was a horrifying sight to behold. I calmly turned around and walked over to my small, cramped desk in the dark corner of the room. I picked up my dead-broken laptop and carefully placed it into my worn canvas backpack. I deliberately zipped the bag closed and swung it over my shoulder. I walked back toward the front door of the grand brownstone, refusing to look back at any of them. My father quickly stepped into the narrow hallway, blocking my path to the exit. He used his deep, booming preacher voice and told me that if I walked out that front door, I would no longer be considered a part of his family. He said I would be completely cut off from the only people in the world who truly loved me and cared about my soul. I looked up at the tall, imposing man who had ignored my existence and crushed my dreams for 3 decades. I smiled a genuine, completely peaceful smile. I told him that being cut off from this family was the greatest blessing God had ever bestowed upon me. I stepped gracefully around his frozen body and reached for the heavy, cold brass doorknob. Julian ran out into the hallway right behind me, breathing heavily like a wild animal. His handsome face was twisted into a dark, ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He screamed that I was making the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of my entire life. He yelled that he was a powerful executive on Wall Street, and he knew exactly how to completely destroy arrogant people like me. He pointed his trembling finger directly at my back and swore he would take absolutely everything I had built with my own 2 hands. He said he would tie my new company up in so much brutal corporate litigation that I would be begging him for pennies on the street before the year was over. He screamed that I would deeply regret disrespecting the golden child of the Evans family and making a powerful enemy out of him. I pulled open the heavy wooden door and stepped out into the cool, crisp Brooklyn air. The heavy door slammed shut loudly behind me, completely cutting off the toxic shouting and the empty, violent threats. I walked quickly down the concrete steps of the brownstone and took a deep, refreshing breath of the city air. For the very first time in my entire 30 years of life, I felt completely unburdened and free. I had finally stood up to my lifelong abusers and walked away from their crushing, suffocating expectations. The long walk to the subway station felt like I was floating above the pavement. I was finally ready to embrace my new amazing life as an independent, incredibly successful woman. I honestly thought the dark nightmare was finally over. I foolishly thought walking out of that door was the final end of the long family war. But I was incredibly wrong. The toxic entitlement of my family ran much deeper than I had ever realized. Julian was not just making empty, dramatic threats in the heat of the moment to save his fragile ego. 3 days later, a serious-looking process server showed up at the front desk of my corporate office, holding a massive, thick stack of legal documents that would threaten to completely destroy everything I had fought so hard to build. I stared at the towering stack of crisp white legal papers sitting heavily on my sleek glass desk. The process server had practically sprinted out of the lobby after dropping the terrifying binder into my receptionist's hands. The front page was stamped with the imposing gold seal of Vanguard Legacy Bank and a premier Wall Street law firm that charged thousands of dollars an hour. My hands were surprisingly steady as I slowly flipped through the dense pages of aggressive legal jargon. Julian had not wasted a single second. He had actually convinced the senior partners at his massive investment bank to unleash their most vicious corporate attack dogs on my newly discovered tech empire. The official complaint listed multiple devastating charges. Julian was officially suing me for outright theft of intellectual property, corporate fraud, and breach of implied contract. He had somehow managed to convince a federal judge to sign an emergency temporary injunction. That single piece of paper effectively froze every single bank account tied to Nexus Artificial Intelligence. The injunction also blocked my company from executing any new federal contracts until the ownership dispute was entirely resolved in a court of law. It was a classic corporate starvation tactic. Julian knew I had built Nexus from the ground up without taking money from predatory venture capitalists. He knew my personal wealth was entirely tied up in the company equity. By freezing the corporate assets, he was trying to instantly cut off my oxygen supply. He wanted to bankrupt me before I could even step foot inside a courtroom. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair and let out a long, slow breath. The sheer weight of corporate power bearing down on me was intentionally designed to inspire pure panic. Julian was using the unlimited financial resources of a multi-billion-dollar investment bank to completely crush his little sister. My lead software engineers were already knocking frantically on my glass office door. They had just received the automated notifications from our payroll provider that the company funds were locked. The entire floor of my bustling office was suddenly filled with an anxious, tense murmur. My employees relied on me to feed their families, and Julian was carelessly playing with all of their lives just to satisfy his toxic, fragile ego. I stood up and walked out of my office to address my panicked team. I looked at the dozens of brilliant, dedicated people who had trusted me enough to leave their comfortable jobs and join my stealth startup. I kept my voice perfectly level and projected a deep sense of unshakable confidence. I told them there was a minor administrative hold on our accounts due to a frivolous legal filing. I personally guaranteed that every single paycheck would clear by the end of the week, even if I had to liquidate my own personal assets to make it happen. My calm demeanor immediately diffused the rising panic in the room. They went back to their desks, trusting me completely. They did not know that I was currently staring down the barrel of a massive corporate firing squad. I watched them through the glass walls of my office. My team was incredibly diverse, filled with brilliant women and minorities who had been overlooked by the massive tech giants in Silicon Valley. We had built an incredible, supportive culture together. Julian was not just attacking me, he was threatening the livelihood of every single person who had believed in my vision. The anger I felt was no longer just about my family treating me poorly. It was about a powerful, corrupt man trying to destroy innocent, hardworking people just to line his own pockets. When I returned to my quiet office, my personal cell phone began to ring. The caller ID displayed Julian's name. I let it ring 3 times before I finally answered the call. I did not say hello. I just waited for him to speak. Julian's voice came through the speaker, dripping with a sickening level of smug satisfaction. He said, "I hope you enjoyed reading that little care package I sent over this morning, Morgan." He told me the legal team at Vanguard Legacy did not lose cases. He boasted that they had unlimited funding and could easily drag this intellectual property lawsuit out for 10 long years if they wanted to. He said by the time the judge finally makes a ruling, your little artificial intelligence company will be absolutely worthless and you will be completely buried in legal debt. I listened to him gloat and felt a familiar, deep disgust. He actually thought he was a brilliant military strategist. He thought he had cornered me. He said Sloan was already picking out the custom marble countertops for their new Hamptons estate because they both knew I would surrender. He told me Sloan was actually the one who suggested filing the emergency injunction. She had wanted to make sure I could not hide any of the company assets or transfer the funds into a private offshore account. The thought of my racist and entitled sister-in-law actively plotting to steal my wealth made my stomach physically turn. She had spent years mocking my intelligence, and now she was eagerly calculating how to spend the money my intelligence had generated. He offered me one final patronizing deal. He told me if I simply signed the equity transfer documents by Friday, he would call off the corporate lawyers and let me keep a tiny 5% stake in my own company. He said it was my absolute last chance to avoid total financial ruin. I did not scream at him. I did not beg him to reconsider. I simply asked him if his senior executives at Vanguard Legacy Bank were fully aware that he was using their highly expensive corporate legal team to settle a petty family dispute over a broken 10-year-old laptop. Julian laughed a dark, arrogant laugh. He said his bosses trusted him implicitly. He told me he was their golden boy who brought in millions of dollars in compliance revenue every single quarter. He confidently stated that they did not care what he did as long as he kept making them incredibly rich. He said, "You are completely out of your league, little sister. You are playing a high-stakes game with the big boys now, and you are going to lose absolutely everything." He abruptly ended the call, leaving me sitting in the silence of my office. The heavy threat hung in the air, but I did not feel the crushing defeat he was desperately hoping for. Julian was so incredibly blinded by his own toxic arrogance that he had completely failed to see the massive fatal flaw in his aggressive legal strategy. By officially bringing Vanguard Legacy Bank into this fight, he had unknowingly triggered the exact sequence of events I had been quietly preparing for. He had proudly attached his employer's name and vast resources to a fraudulent lawsuit. He was entirely convinced that his banking executives were an impenetrable shield that would protect his lies forever. I slowly reached across my desk and picked up the thick, intimidating binder of legal threats. I tossed it casually into the metal trash can in the corner of the room. It landed with a satisfying heavy thud. Julian thought he was starving me out. He thought he had successfully isolated me and cut off my only source of power. But his aggressive legal injunction was nothing more than a desperate temper tantrum from a man who had absolutely no idea what my software was actually designed to do. He did not realize that the longer he kept his bank involved in my business, the deeper he dragged himself into a trap he could never possibly escape. I picked up my secure office phone and dialed the direct encrypted line to my lead attorney. The corporate war had officially begun. But what Julian did not understand was that I had spent my entire childhood learning how to survive with absolutely nothing. I had taught myself how to build something beautiful out of broken, discarded pieces, while he had everything handed to him on a silver platter. His power was entirely borrowed from the institution he worked for, but my power was built into my own mind. I was more than ready to let Julian completely destroy himself. The very next morning, my phone began vibrating continuously on my nightstand. It was not emails from my legal team or panicked calls from my engineers. It was an endless stream of social media notifications. My stomach tightened as I opened the application. My face was everywhere, but it was not the polished professional portrait from the cover of Time magazine. It was a grainy, zoomed-in photo taken from across the dining table at my parents' anniversary dinner. Right below my picture was a highly edited, emotionally manipulative video posted by Sloane. She was sitting on the plush white couch in her expensive living room. She was wearing no makeup and a simple, oversized sweater to make herself look fragile and defenseless. She looked directly into the camera and forced her pale blue eyes to well up with tears. She took a shaky, dramatic breath and began to speak with a trembling voice. She told her thousands of followers that her family was currently going through a horrific nightmare. She claimed that her ungrateful and deeply malicious sister-in-law was actively trying to destroy her husband's hard-earned career. She used all the perfect buzzwords designed to trigger public outrage. She called me a hostile, aggressive woman who was trying to steal the tech company that Julian had supposedly built and funded out of the goodness of his heart. Sloane looked down at her hands and let a single perfect tear roll down her cheek. She said Julian supported her when she had absolutely nothing. He gave her the computers and the money she needed to survive. And now that the company is finally successful, she is illegally locking us out and trying to leave us completely bankrupt right before the holidays. She begged the internet to share her story and help her hold me accountable. She completely weaponized her tears to play the ultimate victim. She painted herself and Julian as the generous, innocent saviors who were being violently attacked by a greedy, heartless black woman. The internet backlash was immediate and absolutely ferocious. People who had never even met me were flooding my company pages and my personal accounts with horrific comments. They called me a thief and a fraud. They demanded that my government contracts be canceled immediately. Sloane's post had been shared tens of thousands of times within just a few hours. The court of public opinion was heavily stacked against me, and the racist undertones of the comments were completely sickening. They were so eager to believe that a wealthy white savior and her successful banker husband were the true brains behind my software empire. I sat on the edge of my bed and watched the video play on a silent loop. I did not cry. I just felt a deep, familiar exhaustion. This was exactly how Sloane operated. She had a long documented history of stealing my hard work and gaslighting me into silence while playing the innocent victim. My mind drifted back to a crisp Sunday morning 5 years ago. My father's church was hosting a massive winter charity drive for the homeless community in Brooklyn. I had spent 3 entire months organizing the logistics. I called local businesses to secure food donations. I rented the delivery trucks. I spent countless nights sorting through hundreds of heavy boxes of winter coats in the damp church basement all by myself. On the final morning of the charity drive, the church was packed with local politicians and news reporters. The event was a massive success. I was standing in the back of the fellowship hall, covered in dust and sweat, holding a clipboard with all the delivery schedules. That is when Sloane suddenly appeared. She was wearing a flawless designer dress and a bright, perfect smile. She had not lifted a single finger to help for 3 months. But the moment she saw the local news cameras setting up near the front stage, she walked straight up to the microphone. My father, Reverend James, proudly introduced Sloane to the congregation as the brilliant, compassionate director of the winter drive. Sloane smiled modestly and took the microphone. She told the cameras how exhausted she was from working so hard on this project. She talked about her deep personal commitment to helping the less fortunate. The entire congregation clapped and cheered for her. I walked up to my mother and quietly asked why Sloane was taking credit for the months of grueling physical labor that I had done alone. My mother quickly grabbed my arm and dug her fingernails into my skin. She told me to lower my voice and stop being so jealous and petty. She said Sloane presents better on television than you do, Morgan. She has the right look for the church image. Just let her have this moment. Do not ruin our blessing with your bitter attitude. I stood in the back of the room and watched Sloane confidently steal my credit, my labor, and my praise. Julian stood right next to her, holding her hand and looking so incredibly proud. When the cameras stopped rolling, Sloane walked past me and whispered that I should really go wash my face because I looked like a complete mess. She took everything I built and made everyone believe it belonged to her. That memory burned brightly in my mind as I stared at her fake crying video on my phone screen. She thought she could run the exact same play again. She thought she could step in front of the cameras, point her manicured finger at me, and steal a $3 billion company the same way she stole a church charity drive. She heavily relied on the fact that I had always stayed silent to keep the peace. She thought the overwhelming public pressure and the vicious online hate would force me into hiding. She did not realize that the girl who used to cry in the church basement was completely gone. I calmly locked my phone and walked into my bathroom to get dressed for the day. The smear campaign was vicious and loud, but it was built entirely on a fragile foundation of lies. They were playing a loud public game of checkers while I was quietly positioning the final pieces on a chessboard they could not even see. Julian and Sloane wanted the public spotlight so desperately. I decided I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to let the blinding light of the truth expose every single dark corner of their lives. I walked out of my apartment and headed straight to my office to finalize the trap. The moment I stepped off the elevator and onto the executive floor of my company, I could feel the heavy panic hanging in the air. The vicious social media smear campaign was no longer just a public relations nightmare. It had officially bled into the financial sector. My chief financial officer, Marcus, was pacing back and forth outside my glass office door, holding a stack of printed emails. He looked like he had not slept in days. He followed me inside and shut the door tightly behind us. He told me we were bleeding capital at an alarming rate. Julian had not stopped at just filing a fraudulent legal injunction. He was now actively weaponizing his powerful title as a vice president at Vanguard Legacy Bank to completely blackball me across the entire tech industry. He had spent the entire morning making aggressive phone calls to his wealthy fraternity brothers and his elite connections at major venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. He was spreading the lie that my company was under federal investigation for stealing proprietary algorithms. He told them that anyone who invested in Nexus Artificial Intelligence would be considered an accomplice to corporate fraud. Marcus placed the printed emails on my desk. They were official withdrawal notices from 3 of our largest institutional investors. The massive Series B funding round that we were supposed to close by the end of the month had been completely pulled. Our leading investors were suddenly too terrified of the legal liability Julian had fabricated. They were freezing their term sheets and demanding emergency audits before they would release another single dollar to us. The combination of the frozen bank accounts and the collapsed funding round meant our cash flow was effectively dead. I read through the formal rejection letters one by one. These were venture capitalists who had praised my genius just a week ago. Now they were cowardly running for the hills because a powerful man in a tailored suit had threatened them over the phone. It was a painful reminder of how quickly the corporate world will turn their backs on you when things get difficult. They did not care about the truth. They only cared about protecting their own profit margins. Marcus looked at me with genuine fear in his eyes. He told me that if we could not secure an emergency bridge loan by Friday, we would not be able to cover the server hosting costs for our existing clients. The entire network would go dark. All of our operations would instantly shut down, and we would be forced to lay off the entire staff. Julian was systematically dismantling my $3 billion empire piece by piece. He was suffocating the company just like a python slowly crushing its prey. He wanted to create so much financial panic that my own board of directors would force me to sign over the equity just to save the company. I told Marcus to take a deep breath and go home to his family. I promised him the servers would not go dark, and nobody was going to lose their job. He looked extremely doubtful, but he nodded slowly and walked out of the office, leaving me entirely alone. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out over the sprawling city skyline. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the busy streets below. My phone buzzed softly on my desk. It was a text message from Julian. It simply read, "The well is running dry. Little sister time to surrender before you drown." He was so incredibly proud of himself. He genuinely believed he had backed me into an inescapable corner. He thought his Wall Street connections made him completely untouchable. He was drunk on his own borrowed power and desperate to see me beg for his mercy. I could easily picture him sitting in his corner office sipping expensive scotch and laughing with Sloane about how easy it was to ruin my life. But he was far too arrogant to realize that he was fighting an invisible war. He thought he was cutting off my oxygen supply, but he was actually just handing me the exact weapon I needed to completely destroy him. I walked back to my desk and sat down in my leather chair. I placed my phone face down and pushed the legal documents aside. I typed a complex sequence of passwords into my desktop computer and bypassed the standard company network. A hidden secure dashboard slowly loaded on my large high-definition monitor. It was a private server portal that only I had access to. The screen was filled with endless streams of raw encrypted data, scrolling rapidly against a dark background. I watched the numbers and codes flash across the screen, and a slow, satisfied smile spread across my face. This was the exact mistake I had been patiently waiting for him to make. By officially using his position at Vanguard Legacy Bank to file the injunction and threaten my investors, Julian had legally intertwined his employer with my company. He had opened a direct digital bridge between his bank's highly secured internal network and my artificial intelligence compliance software. He thought he was using his bank to monitor my assets and freeze my accounts, but he had unknowingly given my algorithm full, unrestricted access to blindly audit every single financial transaction he had executed over the past 5 years. My software was not just sitting idle while he attacked my company. It was actively working in the background, quietly scanning his personal and professional ledgers. It was cross-referencing every single loan approval, every risk assessment, and every massive bonus payout he had ever authorized for himself. Julian thought he was successfully suffocating my company. He had absolutely no idea that my artificial intelligence had already finished mapping out his entire criminal history. The digital evidence was piling up by the terabyte. The trap was finally set, and the jaws were about to snap shut. I sat forward in my leather chair and watched the endless lines of encrypted data cascade down the dark screen. My toxic family and the cowardly venture capitalists all thought Nexus Artificial Intelligence was just another standard tech startup trying to sell basic security software to corporate clients. They thought my $3 billion valuation was based entirely on private sector speculation and Silicon Valley hype, but they were completely missing the largest and most terrifying piece of the puzzle. 3 months ago, I had walked into a highly secured federal boardroom in Washington, D.C., and signed a binding exclusive contract with the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Reserve. The federal government had grown completely exhausted by Wall Street banks hiding their toxic assets and repeatedly lying on their quarterly compliance reports. The regulatory agencies were tired of handing out minor fines that amounted to nothing more than a simple cost of doing business for these corrupt institutions. They desperately needed a modern weapon that could bypass the human element entirely. They needed an algorithm that could not be bribed, intimidated, or lied to. They needed a system that could easily see through the sophisticated smoke and mirrors of modern high finance. They needed Nexus. When Julian proudly boasted at the family dinner about being a powerful vice president of compliance at Vanguard Legacy Bank, he was actually boasting about being the absolute weakest link in a highly corrupt financial chain. His specific bank had been officially selected as the primary target for the Federal Reserve's very first beta test of my audit software. For the past 90 days, my algorithm had been quietly living inside Vanguard Legacy's internal servers. It was functioning exactly like a digital ghost, entirely invisible to their highly paid cybersecurity teams. It did not just look at the perfectly polished financial spreadsheets the bank happily presented to the public. It aggressively dug deep into the raw metadata, tracing the exact digital origins of every single financial document. It searched for hidden offshore routing numbers, forged digital timestamps, and risk assessment documents that had been manually altered just hours before federal inspections took place. My artificial intelligence was explicitly designed to hunt down arrogant executives who thought they were significantly smarter than the law. Executives who truly believed their expensive tailored suits and Ivy League degrees made them completely untouchable. Executives exactly like my brother. I typed a specific command into my secure keyboard and filtered the massive ocean of banking data. I instructed the algorithm to isolate the entire digital footprint of one specific employee over the last 5 years, Julian Evans. The screen flickered for a mere fraction of a second before hundreds of red-flagged files flooded the large high-definition monitor. I leaned closer to the screen and carefully read the internal banking documents that Julian thought he had permanently deleted from the system. The sheer volume of his corporate fraud was absolutely staggering. He had not earned a single one of his massive annual bonuses through hard work or brilliant financial strategy. He had systematically falsified the risk profiles of hundreds of massive commercial real estate loans. He was intentionally hiding hundreds of millions of dollars in highly toxic, unrecoverable debt, so his specific compliance department would appear perfectly profitable on paper. He had personally forged the digital signatures of junior analysts and young interns to cover his sophisticated tracks, making absolutely sure they would take the immediate fall if the bank was ever investigated by the government. He had built his entire lavish lifestyle, his tailored Italian suits, his brand new Hamptons estate, and his smug superiority on a massive, fragile mountain of federal crimes. The deep, poetic irony of the situation washed over me like a cold, refreshing wave. Julian had spent his entire life looking down on me. He and Sloane had aggressively mocked my intelligence and demanded that I bow down to their superior social status. They had launched a vicious, highly calculated smear campaign to paint me as a hostile, ungrateful thief who was actively trying to steal his hard-earned success. They had successfully convinced the entire internet and our extended family that I was a greedy villain. Yet right here in plain glowing text on my secure monitor was the undeniable verified proof that he was the only true thief in the Evans family. His arrogance was so incredibly vast that he had unknowingly used the very bank he was actively defrauding to file a corporate lawsuit against the exact federal contractor who was currently auditing him. He had essentially hand-delivered his own federal arrest warrant directly to my office desk. If I simply pressed one single button on my keyboard, all of this encrypted data would be instantly transmitted to the primary enforcement division of the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington. The armed federal agents would raid the Vanguard Legacy headquarters before the stock market even opened the next morning. Julian would be dragged out of his beautiful corner office in heavy steel handcuffs on live national television. Sloane would be forced to watch her entire wealthy identity crumble into absolute dust. But sending the files directly to the government from the quiet safety of my office felt far too easy. It would not give him the opportunity to fully understand exactly who had defeated him. Julian and Sloane had aggressively demanded a public spectacle. They had dragged my name through the mud on public platforms and tried to humiliate me into absolute submission. They wanted to force me to sit at their grand negotiation table to sign away my life's work. So I decided I was going to give them exactly what they arrogantly asked for. I was going to attend their little corporate negotiation meeting. I opened a secure printing application on my desktop and sent the compiled federal audit report to my private encrypted printer. The machine hummed to life, quietly spitting out page after page of undeniable, heavily documented truth. The reports detailed every single forged signature, every illegal wire transfer, and every single toxic asset he had intentionally hidden from federal regulators. I carefully gathered the warm sheets of paper and slid them into a thick, unmarked manila folder. This single folder held the absolute power to completely vaporize Julian's prestigious career, his stolen wealth, and his personal freedom. It was the ultimate equalizer. I looked out my office window at the darkening city streets below. I thought about my parents sitting in their Brooklyn brownstone blindly praying for Julian's continued success while actively condemning my soul. They worshipped the golden child because he provided them with the cheap illusion of elite status. They had completely sold their morality for the comfort of a luxury sedan and the bragging rights at their Sunday church service. They were all going to learn a very painful permanent lesson about the devastating consequences of building a legacy on lies. I placed the manila folder into my leather briefcase and locked the brass clasps with a sharp, satisfying click. Julian thought he was summoning a terrified, helpless younger sister to surrender her company. He had absolutely no idea he was actually inviting the federal executioner of his career right into his own boardroom. I turned off my office lights and walked out to the elevator, fully ready to finish the war he had so arrogantly started. The next morning, I walked through the massive revolving glass doors of Vanguard Legacy Bank. The lobby was a sprawling monument to excessive corporate wealth. Towering marble pillars reached up to a vaulted ceiling, and silent security guards in dark suits stood at every corner. I checked in at the sleek reception desk and was immediately escorted to the private executive elevator by a young assistant who looked at my casual clothes with obvious disdain. My leather briefcase felt incredibly heavy in my right hand, but my posture was perfectly straight and my breathing was completely calm. The high-speed elevator silently shot up to the 50th floor, making my ears pop slightly. The metal doors slid open to reveal a massive glass-enclosed boardroom that looked out over the entire sweeping skyline of the financial district. I walked slowly into the cold room. They were all already sitting around a massive polished mahogany table, waiting for their absolute surrender. Julian was sitting at the very center of the table, looking like a triumphant king holding court. He was wearing a brand new custom-tailored navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a smug, satisfied smile that took up his entire face. Sloane was sitting right next to him, wearing a flawless white cashmere sweater and sipping expensive sparkling water from a crystal glass. She looked at me with that familiar, incredibly fake pity. It was the exact same look she gave the homeless people outside of our church on Sunday mornings. To my absolute disgust, my parents were sitting right there on the other side of the long table. Julian had actually dragged Reverend James and Patricia all the way from their Brooklyn home just to play their designated roles in this pathetic corporate theater. They were his ultimate emotional weapons, specifically brought here to guilt-trip me into total submission. Sitting at the absolute head of the table was a man I instantly recognized from countless financial news networks. It was Richard Sterling, the powerful chief executive officer of Vanguard Legacy Bank. He was an older, wealthy white man with slicked-back silver hair and a deeply impatient expression. He was busy tapping his expensive gold pen against a leather-bound notepad, completely ignoring my arrival. I pulled out a heavy leather executive chair opposite of Julian and sat down. I placed my locked briefcase flat on the polished table in front of me. Julian immediately leaned forward and steepled his large fingers together. He looked at me and let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief. He said, "Morgan, I am so incredibly glad you finally decided to be reasonable and join us today. We were starting to genuinely worry that you were going to force our hand and make us destroy your little startup completely." Sloane reached across the wide table and tried to place her pale hand softly over mine, but I quickly pulled my hand away and rested it in my lap. She frowned deeply and pulled her hand back, adjusting her massive diamond wedding ring. She said, "We know this has been a very stressful week for you, darling. We just want to put all of this ugly, horrible business behind us, so we can go back to being a happy, loving family again. We even brought your parents here today to help mediate and ensure everything is handled with total grace and true Christian forgiveness." My mother, Patricia, nodded eagerly from across the table and dabbed the corners of her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. She said, "Morgan, we have been praying for your confused soul every single night. The Lord told us that pride comes right before the fall. You have been so incredibly stubborn and hostile to your own flesh and blood. But your brother Julian has a heart of absolute gold. He is willing to forgive your terrible, disrespectful behavior and save you from total bankruptcy. You should be thanking him on your bare knees right now instead of looking so angry." My father, Reverend James, crossed his thick arms over his chest and stared at me with intense, heavy disappointment. He used his deep, booming preaching voice that was explicitly meant to echo in a crowded church and intimidate his congregation. He said, "You have embarrassed this family name enough, Morgan. You tried to steal your brother's angel investment and you lied to the general public about building that company by yourself. But today is a blessed day of healing. You are going to sign these legal documents and make this right in the strict eyes of God and the law." I sat there in absolute silence and let them pour their toxic religious guilt all over the boardroom table. It was truly a terrifying masterclass in psychological manipulation. They had entirely convinced themselves of their own completely fabricated reality. Julian then turned his attention to the chief executive officer eagerly wanting to show off his power and control over the situation. He said, "Mr. Sterling, this is my younger sister Morgan. She is the one who has been running the basic administrative side of the artificial intelligence project I originally funded. She is a bit out of her depth in the complex corporate world, but she is finally ready to cooperate with us now." Richard Sterling did not even bother to look me in the eye when I was introduced. He kept his arrogant gaze fixed on his expensive notepad. He spoke with a cold, dismissive tone that dripped with pure corporate elitism. He said, "Let us make this extremely quick, Miss Evans. I have a very important golf tee time at 1 o'clock, and I do not like wasting my valuable morning on petty domestic squabbles. Your brother is a highly valued and highly profitable executive at this prestigious institution. Vanguard Legacy Bank completely stands behind him and fully supports his legal claims to your company. Your business accounts are completely frozen. Your venture capital investors have entirely abandoned you based on our recommendations. You have absolutely zero leverage in this room today." The chief executive officer finally stopped tapping his heavy gold pen and looked up at me with cold, dead eyes. He said, "Julian has graciously drafted a very generous settlement agreement for you. You will officially sign over 50% of the total equity in Nexus Artificial Intelligence. You will also surrender all voting rights. In exchange, Vanguard Legacy will immediately lift the legal injunction and allow you to access your remaining operating funds to pay your little employees. If you refuse to sign this extremely fair offer, I will personally instruct our aggressive legal department to tie you up in federal court until you cannot even afford to buy a cup of coffee. Do we understand each other, Miss Evans?" The sheer audacity floating in that glass room was thick enough to choke on. They were holding my entire life hostage, threatening to destroy the livelihood of my employees, and acting like they were doing me a massive favor. Julian smiled a massive, greedy smile and slid a thick, heavy stack of legal documents across the smooth mahogany table. A pristine silver pen was resting neatly on top of the crisp white pages. He pointed a manicured finger at the signature line at the very bottom of the final page. Julian said, "Just sign the paper, Morgan. Sign the paper and you can go back to playing with your computers in absolute peace. My team will gladly take over the complicated adult business side of the company from here. You do not have to worry your pretty little head about making the hard financial decisions anymore." Sloane softly clapped her hands together. She said, "Oh, this is so wonderful. We are finally moving forward as a family. I have already started looking at expensive interior decorators for the new Hamptons House Morgan. You should absolutely come visit us once the renovations are fully finished. We might even let you stay in the little guest house over the weekend if you behave yourself and learn some respect." I looked down at the thick settlement contract sitting right in front of me. The silver pen was gleaming brightly under the harsh fluorescent office lights. The entire room was dead silent, watching my every single move like a pack of hungry predators, waiting for their injured prey to finally bleed out. My parents were nodding at me encouragingly, completely blind to the corporate theft happening right in front of their eyes. Julian was practically vibrating in his leather chair with greedy excitement. The chief executive officer was already checking his heavy gold watch, anticipating an incredibly easy victory over a terrified young woman. They genuinely thought I was broken. They thought the empty corporate threats, the frozen bank accounts, and the toxic family guilt had successfully crushed my independent spirit. They thought I had walked into this building to surrender my $3 billion empire. I slowly reached out my right hand and picked up the cold silver pen. Julian's triumphant smile grew so wide, it looked like his face might actually split in half. But I did not move the pen down toward the signature line on the paper. Instead, I calmly placed the pen down on the polished wood and slowly pushed the thick contract right back across the wide table. It slid to a sudden halt directly in front of Julian's arrogant face. I reached out and unlocked the heavy brass clasps of my leather briefcase. The sharp metal click echoed loudly in the totally silent glass boardroom. I looked directly at the chief executive officer and told him to cancel his golf tee time because his bank was about to face a massive federal emergency. The chief executive officer let out a sharp, abrasive laugh that bounced off the glass walls. He looked at Julian and shook his head like he was dealing with a delusional child. Julian immediately scrambled to regain total control of the room. His face flushed with angry red patches as he grabbed the thick legal contract and aggressively shoved it back across the table toward me. It hit my leather briefcase with a loud smack. Julian leaned halfway across the mahogany table. His veins were bulging in his thick neck. He said, "You really think you can walk into a multi-billion-dollar financial institution and make empty dramatic threats, Morgan? You think because a magazine put your face on their cover that you suddenly have actual power in the real world?" He pointed his manicured finger directly at my face and began a long, suffocating lecture that he had probably been practicing in the mirror for days. He told me I was acting like an emotional little girl throwing a temper tantrum because she did not want to share her toys. He said, "This is exactly why you need me on your board of directors, Morgan. You have absolutely no idea how real adults do business. In the real world, we do not make up imaginary federal emergencies just to get out of signing a legally binding document. In the real corporate world, power is determined by capital and absolute leverage. Vanguard Legacy Bank has hundreds of billions of dollars in capital. You have absolutely nothing but a frozen bank account and a massive fragile ego." He tapped the silver pen violently against the paper. He said, "I am offering you a golden parachute. I am offering to let you keep 50% of a company that is currently worth nothing without my protection. If you sign this paper, I will personally call off the lawyers. I will let you go back to your dark basement and you can keep playing with your little computers all day long. I will handle the complex financial structuring. I will handle the federal regulators. I will do the actual adult work while you take the credit." Sloane sighed heavily and looked at my mother with a deeply concerned expression. She said, "Patricia, I am genuinely worried about her mental state right now. She is completely disassociating from reality. Making up lies about federal emergencies is a very clear sign of a nervous breakdown. The stress of pretending to be a chief executive officer has clearly broken her fragile mind." My mother nodded slowly and looked at me with profound pity. She said, "Morgan, please stop this embarrassing charade right now. Mr. Sterling is a very important man, and you are wasting his incredibly valuable time. Julian is trying to save you from yourself. Just sign the paper and let your brother guide you. He knows exactly how these massive corporate institutions operate. You are just a programmer." I did not interrupt them. I sat perfectly still and let them empty every single ounce of their toxic arrogance into the quiet room. I wanted them to put all of their cards on the table. I wanted Julian to go on the official record loudly boasting about how he handles federal regulators and complex financial structuring. I wanted the chief executive officer to sit there and proudly endorse Julian's behavior. They were digging their own corporate graves with every single patronizing word that fell out of their mouths, and I was more than happy to hand them the shovels. Richard Sterling checked his heavy gold watch again and let out an exaggerated sigh of sheer boredom. He said, "Miss Evans, my patience has officially run out. You have exactly 60 seconds to pick up that pen and sign the equity transfer agreement. If you do not sign it, I am calling bank security to physically escort you out of my building. And then I am instructing my legal department to file a motion to completely liquidate your startup by the end of the day. There is no federal emergency. There is only your impending bankruptcy." I looked at the incredibly powerful men sitting across from me. They were entirely blinded by their own institutional hubris. They genuinely believed that their expensive suits and their towering glass skyscrapers made them completely invincible. They thought the rules did not apply to them because they were the ones who wrote the rules. I took a slow, calm breath. The 60-second countdown was ticking away in the silent room. I reached my hand into my open leather briefcase. My fingers brushed against the thick, rough paper of the manila folder I had printed earlier that morning. I slowly pulled the heavy folder out of the bag. I did not say a single word. I simply held it in my hands for a brief moment, letting the absolute weight of what it contained settle over me. I placed the thick folder squarely in the center of the polished mahogany table, directly next to Julian's predatory contract. It was a completely plain manila folder, except for one very specific detail. Stamped perfectly in the upper right corner in raised blue and gold metallic ink was the official embossed seal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. The bright overhead fluorescent lights caught the metallic reflection of the federal seal. The bold, imposing eagle and the heavy scale of justice seemed to glow against the dull brown paper. The room instantly plunged into an absolute suffocating silence. It was fascinating to watch the human brain process sudden, terrifying information. Julian stopped his aggressive finger pointing. His mouth remained slightly open, but the words completely died in his throat. He stared blankly at the gold seal, trying to comprehend how a useless tech nerd had managed to acquire highly classified government stationery. Sloane leaned forward, her pale blue eyes squinting at the folder as if it were a literal bomb sitting on the table. But the most dramatic shift happened at the head of the table. Richard Sterling, the arrogant billionaire chief executive officer who had just threatened to throw me out of the building, suddenly went completely rigid. The bored, dismissive look on his face vanished in a microsecond. As a man who had spent his entire life navigating the treacherous waters of high finance, he recognized that specific federal seal immediately. He knew exactly what it meant when a document bearing that exact stamp appeared on his boardroom table. It never meant anything good. I leaned back in my leather chair and folded my hands neatly in my lap. The predatory contract Julian had tried to force down my throat suddenly looked like a meaningless piece of scrap paper next to the devastating weight of the federal government. I looked calmly at Mr. Sterling and told him that my 60 seconds were not up yet, and I highly recommended he open that folder before he called his security guards. Mr. Sterling stared at the embossed gold and blue seal. His experienced eyes darted from the manila folder to my completely relaxed face. He had dealt with bluffers and corporate extortionists his entire career, but he possessed the deeply ingrained survival instinct of a Wall Street veteran. He knew that faking a federal seal was a severe felony that carried mandatory federal prison time. No sane person would walk into a multi-billion-dollar investment bank and place a forged government document on an executive table just to win a petty family argument. Julian let out a forced, nervous chuckle that sounded like glass grinding together. He reached his hand out rapidly, trying to snatch the folder away from the center of the table. He told his boss not to entertain my pathetic theatrical stunt. He said she probably printed that shiny sticker off the internet. Mr. Sterling, please do not humor her. Ridiculous delusion. Let me just call security right now and have her permanently removed from the premises. But Richard Sterling firmly slapped his heavy wrinkled hand down on Julian's wrist, stopping him dead in his tracks. The chief executive officer did not say a single word. He slowly pulled the manila folder toward himself. The boardroom was so painfully quiet that the sound of the thick paper sliding across the polished mahogany wood echoed like a loud rasp. He flipped open the heavy cover. His eyes immediately locked onto the official letterhead. The document was explicitly addressed to the Director of Enforcement at the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington, D.C. The subject line read, Vanguard Legacy Bank, Preliminary Artificial Intelligence Audit Findings. Mr. Sterling's breathing completely stopped. The arrogant, bored posture he had maintained all morning completely collapsed into the leather chair. He pulled his reading glasses out of his breast pocket with a hand that was visibly shaking. I leaned forward, resting my arms comfortably on the table. I decided to formally introduce my company to the room. I told them that Nexus Artificial Intelligence was not a struggling little startup begging for venture capital money. I explained that 3 months ago I had signed an exclusive, highly classified contract with the federal government. My software was explicitly designed to infiltrate massive financial institutions and blindly audit their internal compliance departments without ever triggering their expensive cybersecurity alarms. I looked directly at Julian and told him that his prestigious bank was selected as our very first primary target. I told him my algorithm had been quietly living inside his heavily guarded network for 90 straight days. My mother looked back and forth between Julian and the chief executive officer. She was deeply confused by the sudden terrifying shift in the room's energy. She asked Julian what an audit meant and why his powerful boss suddenly looked so physically ill. Sloane picked at the hem of her white cashmere sweater nervously. She told me to stop speaking in complicated tech riddles and just sign the legal paper so they could all go home and celebrate. They were so heavily insulated by their own ignorance and arrogance that they could not comprehend the massive explosive device sitting wide open on the table. I ignored my family and kept my eyes locked entirely on the chief executive officer. I told Mr. Sterling to read the executive summary out loud for the room. I told him that since my brother was so incredibly eager to handle the complex financial structuring and the federal regulators, he should probably hear exactly what those regulators had to say about his specific department. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. His deep, commanding voice was reduced to a hollow, raspy whisper. He began to read the cold, hard numbers printed on the crisp white page. He read that the algorithm had identified over $347 million in highly toxic, unrecoverable commercial real estate debt. He read that this massive failing debt had been systematically misclassified as prime low-risk assets. He read that over 400 individual risk assessment documents had been manually altered after normal business hours to completely bypass the internal banking safety protocols. Julian's face lost absolutely all of its color. His tanned skin turned the shade of wet concrete. He looked like he was going to be physically sick right there on the expensive table. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic broken squeak escaped his dry throat. Mr. Sterling continued reading the devastating federal report. He read that the artificial intelligence software had successfully traced every single forged digital signature and altered timestamp back to one specific employee login terminal. The report listed the exact employee identification number. Mr. Sterling slowly looked up from the paper. His cold, dead eyes locked directly onto Julian. He said the employee identification number belongs to you, Julian. Every single altered document traces directly back to your secure terminal. Julian violently pushed his heavy leather chair back from the table. He stood up abruptly, his hands waving frantically in the air as if he could magically erase the words that had just been spoken. He stammered and stuttered desperately, trying to construct a believable lie. He said, "It is a massive mistake, Mr. Sterling. The algorithm is completely broken. My sister engineered this fake report to frame me because she is bitter about our childhood. She is just trying to steal my hard-earned money." He looked over at his wife, begging for her to defend him like she always did. But Sloane was staring at the chief executive officer in absolute sheer terror. She finally realized that the immense wealth she was building her entire identity around was completely stolen and about to evaporate into thin air. Mr. Sterling was not listening to Julian's pathetic, desperate excuses. The seasoned banking veteran was rapidly running the catastrophic calculations in his head. He knew exactly what the federal government did to banks that intentionally hid hundreds of millions of dollars in toxic assets. He was staring directly down the barrel of billions of dollars in federal fines, a massive, devastating public relations nightmare, and the potential loss of the bank's international trading licenses. His highly profitable golden boy had just handed the federal government the ultimate weapon to completely destroy the entire financial institution. The smug, condescending smiles that had filled the glass boardroom just 10 minutes ago were entirely gone. The oppressive corporate power they had proudly tried to weaponize against me had been completely neutralized. They genuinely thought they were starving me out and forcing me to surrender my tech empire. They had absolutely no idea I was simply handing them the shovels and letting them dig their own graves so I could push them all in at exactly the same time. I looked at Julian, who was now sweating profusely through his custom-tailored navy suit. His chest was heaving with panic, and his eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated fear. I reminded him about the golden parachute offer he had just made me. I asked him if he still thought he was the powerful man of the house who knew exactly how real adults did business. Julian could not even form a single complete sentence. His jaw worked up and down rapidly, like a suffocating fish pulled fresh from the water. Mr. Sterling slammed the manila folder shut with a violent, heavy crack that made my mother physically jump in her leather seat. The chief executive officer turned to Julian, and his voice was dripping with pure, lethal venom. He demanded to know if a single word in that federal report was true. Julian tried to stammer out a defense, but only pathetic broken syllables escaped his dry lips. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished mahogany, and decided to fill in the missing blanks for my completely stunned family. I looked directly at my father, whose imposing preacher posture had entirely melted into a puddle of absolute confusion. I told him that his golden child was not the brilliant financial prodigy he had spent 30 years bragging about to his loyal congregation. I told him that Julian's massive success was nothing more than a carefully constructed house of cards built on top of a massive criminal enterprise. I explained exactly how the compliance department at Vanguard Legacy Bank actually worked. Julian was hired to be the final, impenetrable line of defense, protecting the bank and the federal government from highly toxic bad investments. But instead of doing his actual job and reporting the failing commercial loans, he discovered a massive digital loophole in the legacy software the bank was using. Whenever a massive real estate loan was about to default and cost the bank millions, Julian would log into his secure terminal and manually rewrite the risk assessment algorithms. He was intentionally hiding hundreds of millions of dollars in highly toxic, unrecoverable debt so his specific division would appear perfectly profitable on the quarterly reports. Why did he do it? I asked the room softly. I looked over at Sloane, who was gripping the edge of the heavy table so hard her knuckles were completely white. I told her it was all for the multi-million-dollar annual performance bonuses. Julian was securing massive 8-figure payouts every single Christmas by artificially inflating the bank's profitability. He was taking home massive fraudulent checks, buying luxury imported sports cars, and putting down massive cash deposits on sweeping Hamptons estates, using money that did not actually exist. My voice grew cold and sharp, echoing loudly off the glass walls. I told them he was not a brilliant Wall Street executive navigating complex global markets. He was a common, arrogant federal criminal committing massive wire fraud, securities fraud, and aggravated identity theft. I revealed the darkest secret buried in the federal report. Julian was not just altering the documents under his own name. He was deliberately stealing the login credentials of junior analysts and young interns straight out of college. He used their digital identities to approve the fraudulent documents, so that if the federal regulators ever caught on some innocent 22-year-old kid with student loans, would take the fall and go to federal prison instead of him. My mother let out a loud, horrific gasp. Patricia shook her head violently from side to side, completely refusing to accept the terrifying reality that was crashing down around her carefully curated life. She pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled, "No, that is an absolute lie. Julian is a good Christian man. He was raised in the church. He would never do something so wicked, Morgan. You are making all of this up to ruin him out of pure spite and bitter jealousy." Mr. Sterling slowly turned his head to look at my mother. The billionaire executive did not care about her religious delusions or her fragile maternal pride. He told her brutally that the federal government does not deal in spite or family drama, they deal strictly in digital forensics. He pointed a heavy gold pen at Julian and told my mother that her good Christian son had just single-handedly exposed Vanguard Legacy Bank to a massive Department of Justice investigation that could easily bankrupt the entire multi-billion-dollar institution. Julian finally found his voice. It was a pathetic, desperate whine that stripped away every ounce of his supposed masculine authority. He looked at Mr. Sterling with wide, terrified eyes and begged him to listen. He said, "Richard, you know exactly how this aggressive industry works. Everyone cuts corners to hit their quarterly targets. I was just doing what I had to do to keep the commercial real estate division afloat. I made this bank hundreds of millions of dollars over the last 5 years. You cannot let a rogue software program destroy my entire life over a few simple clerical errors." I laughed a cold, hard laugh that instantly silenced his pathetic pleading. I told Julian that forging 400 separate risk assessments to deliberately hide $347 million in toxic debt was not a simple clerical error. It was a highly orchestrated long-term criminal conspiracy. I reminded him that he was the senior vice president of compliance. His literal only job requirement was to ensure the bank did not break the law, and instead, he had weaponized his department to become the biggest liability in the history of Wall Street. Sloane suddenly stood up from her chair. The heavy wooden legs scraped loudly against the expensive hardwood floor. She looked at Julian with wide, completely terrified eyes. Her flawless makeup seemed to crack as her face contorted in panic. She asked him if it was true. Her voice was trembling violently. She asked him if the money was all fake. Julian tried to reach across the chairs to grab her hand, but she violently recoiled from his touch like he was covered in a deadly contagious disease. She screamed at him, asking if the bank was going to take away her new house and her cars. The elaborate facade of the perfect wealthy white savior and her highly successful husband was completely shattering right in front of my eyes, reducing them to nothing more than panicked, greedy criminals caught in a trap. Julian desperately tried to pivot his failing strategy. He looked back across the table at me, and his dark eyes were filled with a terrifying mixture of pure hatred and absolute desperate begging. He said, "Morgan, please, you have to pull the federal report. You have absolute administrative access to your software. Just delete the files from the server, and we can walk away from this right now. You can keep your entire tech empire. I will drop the lawsuit today. Just make the federal audit disappear." He was literally asking me to become an active accessory to massive federal corporate fraud right in front of the chief executive officer of the bank. His toxic arrogance had completely blinded him to the basic reality of the situation. I calmly folded my hands on the table and looked deeply into the eyes of the pathetic man who had tormented and belittled me my entire life. I told him that the artificial intelligence did not work for me anymore. I explained that the moment the digital audit was completed, the encrypted files were automatically locked and instantly transferred to the primary federal servers at the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington. There was no magic delete button. There was no going back to the way things were an hour ago. The federal government already possessed every single piece of undeniable digital evidence they needed to put him away in a federal penitentiary for decades. The heavy, crushing reality finally settled over the boardroom. Julian was no longer the powerful executive dictating the cruel terms of my total surrender. He was a dead man walking, waiting for the federal agents to arrive. Richard Sterling slumped back into his heavy leather chair. The crisp white pages of the federal audit report slipped from his trembling hands and scattered across the polished mahogany table. The absolute finality of my words hung in the cold air of the glass boardroom. There was no delete button. The United States government already possessed the encrypted files. The chief executive officer of Vanguard Legacy Bank was a man who had survived market crashes, global recessions, and ruthless corporate takeovers. But right now, he looked like a terrified old man who had just watched his entire empire catch fire. He knew exactly how the Securities and Exchange Commission operated. They did not issue polite warnings for $347 million in hidden toxic debt. They issued billion-dollar fines. They froze assets. They revoked federal trading charters. The bank was staring directly at a catastrophic federal shutdown. The silence in the room was deafening. You could practically hear the power dynamic violently shifting. Just 10 minutes ago, Julian was the golden boy of Wall Street. He was the untouchable senior executive who brought in massive compliance revenue. He was the arrogant older brother who thought he could use a multi-billion-dollar institution to crush his little sister. But in the span of a few seconds, he had transformed into the single greatest liability in the history of the bank. He was radioactive corporate waste. Julian desperately looked at his boss. He reached his shaking hands out toward the scattered papers. He begged Richard to understand, claiming he was protecting the bank and protecting their profit margins. He babbled that they could hire the best defense attorneys in the country and fight the charges in court. He suggested they could lie and say the artificial intelligence software was flawed and fabricated the data. Mr. Sterling slowly turned his head to look at Julian. The sheer level of disgust in his cold eyes was absolutely chilling. He did not see a loyal employee anymore. He saw a massive federal indictment wearing a custom-tailored Navy suit. He asked Julian if he was completely out of his mind. He reminded Julian that he had forged 400 separate risk assessment documents using stolen employee login credentials. He pointed out the massive, undeniable digital trail that led directly back to Julian's secure terminal. He told him there was no fighting this because the federal government had an algorithmic confession, and Julian was going to federal prison. My mother started crying again. She covered her face and rocked back and forth in her chair, completely unable to process the horrifying reality that her perfect son was a criminal. My father just sat there, staring blankly at the wall. The holy, righteous facade he had worn all his life was completely shattered. He had commanded me to submit to a man who was actively defrauding the federal government. Sloane pushed her chair violently away from the table. She stood up and backed away from Julian like he was a dangerous animal. She pointed a shaking finger at him and accused him of lying to her. She screamed that he told her he was a genius and that the money was real. She cried about the house they just bought and the mortgage papers they just signed, knowing the government was going to take absolutely everything from her. She was not crying for her husband. She was crying for her lost luxury. Her entire identity was built on his stolen wealth, and she was watching it burn to the ground. Julian tried to stand up, but his legs completely gave out. He collapsed heavily back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He was breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. The arrogant bully who had mocked my little computer hobby, who had threatened to throw me out on the street, who had launched a vicious smear campaign to ruin my reputation, was completely gone. He was just a terrified, broken man waiting for the sirens. But the most fascinating shift in the room was not Julian. It was Richard Sterling. The billionaire executive slowly turned his attention away from his ruined employee and locked his eyes directly on me. The condescending sneer was completely gone. The bored, dismissive attitude had vanished entirely. He was looking at me with a profound new level of respect and absolute sheer terror. He realized that I had not walked into his boardroom as a helpless victim. I had walked in as the executioner. I had orchestrated this entire meeting perfectly. I had let them show their hands. I had let them mock me and threaten me. And then I had calmly placed the federal weapon on the table and watched them destroy themselves. Mr. Sterling took a slow, deep breath, trying to regain some small fraction of his lost authority. He carefully picked up the scattered pages of the federal report and stacked them neatly together. He looked at the embossed gold seal and then looked back at me. He knew that the Securities and Exchange Commission relied heavily on independent federal contractors to interpret the massive amounts of algorithmic data. He knew that my software company Nexus Artificial Intelligence held the exclusive keys to the federal database. He leaned forward, and his voice was completely stripped of its usual corporate arrogance. He spoke to me like an equal. He said, "Miss Evans, your software has uncovered a catastrophic internal failure at this institution." He claimed Vanguard Legacy Bank was completely unaware of Julian's criminal activities and that they were victims of his fraud just as much as anyone else. I raised an eyebrow and let him spin his desperate corporate narrative. He was already trying to distance the entire multi-billion-dollar bank from the actions of his senior vice president. He was desperately trying to build a legal firewall to protect himself and his board of directors from the incoming federal wrath. Mr. Sterling continued with his voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. He said the Securities and Exchange Commission will undoubtedly use your final audit report to determine the severity of our institutional penalties. He pleaded that if they believe this was a systemic failure of the entire banking culture, they will shut the bank down entirely. He claimed thousands of innocent employees will lose their jobs because of the selfish criminal actions of one man. He was trying to use the exact same emotional manipulation my parents had used earlier, but he was framing it in corporate terms. He wanted me to feel guilty for the impending destruction of his bank. He wanted me to believe that holding Julian accountable would somehow hurt thousands of innocent people. But I had spent my entire life being emotionally manipulated by experts. His corporate guilt trip had absolutely no effect on me. I looked calmly at the chief executive officer. I told him that my algorithm does not care about banking culture or innocent employees. It only cares about raw verified data. And the data explicitly proves that Vanguard Legacy Bank allowed a senior executive to hide hundreds of millions of dollars in toxic debt for over 5 years without ever triggering a single internal alarm. I told him that level of institutional negligence was exactly what the federal government was determined to punish. Mr. Sterling swallowed hard. The harsh reality of my words hit him like a physical blow. He knew I was right. He knew the bank was completely defenseless against the raw, unarguable data my software had collected. He looked at the terrible predatory contract Julian had tried to force me to sign just minutes earlier. He reached out and slowly pushed the useless piece of paper away from the center of the table. He looked at me, and his cold eyes were filled with a desperate, calculating plea. He had finally arrived at the exact moment I had been waiting for all morning. He realized that I was the only person on the planet who could possibly mitigate the incoming federal disaster. He realized that the young black woman sitting across from him, holding a canvas backpack and a dead laptop, held the absolute fate of his multi-billion-dollar empire in the palm of her hands. He folded his hands together on the table and bowed his head slightly in a gesture of complete submission. He told me the bank was prepared to offer me anything. He promised to immediately withdraw the legal injunction against my company. He offered to publicly issue a formal apology to my investors and clear my name in the media. He looked me dead in the eyes and begged me to tell him exactly what it was going to take to save his bank. I looked at the powerful billionaire sitting across from me. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I maintained the exact same cold professional composure I had brought into the room. I told Mr. Sterling that Vanguard Legacy Bank was incredibly lucky that my algorithm was still in its initial federal beta testing phase. I explained that the encrypted audit files were currently sitting on a secure holding server at the Securities and Exchange Commission, waiting for my final administrative review before they were formally submitted to the Aggressive Enforcement Division. I told him that Nexus Artificial Intelligence possessed a highly specialized corporate mitigation software package. If he agreed to my absolute terms, I would immediately deploy the mitigation patch to his internal network. This advanced software would allow his legal department to officially self-report the massive fraud to the federal government before the armed agents actively kicked their doors down. I explained the harsh reality of corporate law to him. In the eyes of the ruthless federal regulators, a bank that discovers its own rogue employee and immediately cooperates is treated vastly differently than a bank that is caught actively hiding a $300 million criminal conspiracy. The mitigation package would save his international trading licenses and likely reduce the impending billion-dollar federal shutdown down to a highly painful but ultimately survivable corporate penalty. Mr. Sterling nodded eagerly, his silver hair catching the bright fluorescent light of the boardroom. He practically threw his heavy hands on the mahogany table and said he would pay whatever licensing fee I demanded. He desperately offered me $50 million right there on the spot for the mitigation software. He said, "Name your absolute price. Miss Evans, the bank will cut the certified check this very second. Just give us the software." I shook my head slowly. I told him my software was not for sale to corrupt institutions. I told him the ultimate price for my cooperation had absolutely nothing to do with corporate cash. I turned my calm gaze slowly toward Julian. My brother was still slumped low in his leather chair, his expensive tailored navy suit completely soaked in cold, terrified sweat. He was shaking so violently that the heavy table was actually vibrating. I looked back at the chief executive officer and delivered my first condition. I told him that Julian Evans is to be terminated effectively, immediately. He is not allowed to resign quietly for personal reasons. He is not going to be given a graceful corporate exit or a standard severance package. He is to be fired for gross criminal misconduct right here in this glass room in front of his entire family. Julian let out a pathetic whimpering sound from the back of his dry throat, but he did not even have the physical strength to look up at me. I continued outlining my exact non-negotiable terms. I told Mr. Sterling that the bank would immediately initiate a full aggressive corporate clawback of every single dollar Julian had been paid over the last 5 years. Every massive Christmas bonus, every unvested stock option, every single fraudulent penny that he had stolen to buy his tailored suits and his luxury sports cars would be legally seized by the institution to help pay for their incoming federal fines. I wanted him completely stripped of his stolen wealth. My mother started crying even louder, covering her face with her trembling hands and begging me to show Christian mercy to my own flesh and blood. I completely ignored her pathetic fake tears and delivered my final devastating condition. I told the chief executive officer that Julian's permanent employment record, his official Form U-5, with the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, would permanently reflect his massive federal fraud. I wanted him placed firmly on the permanent Wall Street blacklist. I wanted to make absolutely sure that no legitimate financial institution in the entire world would ever hire him to manage so much as a petty cash drawer for the rest of his miserable life. I looked Mr. Sterling directly in his cold eyes and asked him if my incredibly simple terms were fully understood. Richard Sterling did not hesitate for a single second. There was no internal corporate debate. There was no consulting with his human resources department or his board of directors. He simply looked at the golden boy who had just jeopardized his entire multi-billion-dollar banking empire and executed his career with absolutely ruthless precision. Mr. Sterling leaned over and pressed a small silver button on the center console of the mahogany table. He spoke clearly into the intercom system and ordered the head of building security to come to the executive boardroom immediately. He then turned his cold, dead eyes directly to my brother. He said, "Julian Evans, you are officially terminated from Vanguard Legacy Bank for gross criminal negligence and massive corporate wire fraud. Your employment is effectively severed as of this exact second. The legal department will be seizing all of your corporate assets, your stock portfolios, and your personal banking accounts tied to this institution by the end of the hour. You are entirely stripped of your title, your rank, and your access." Julian fell out of his heavy leather chair and dropped directly onto his knees on the expensive hardwood floor. He clasped his shaking hands together and actually started begging. He crawled desperately toward his boss, leaving wet tear stains on the collar of his crisp white shirt. He cried out that he had dedicated his entire adult life to this bank. He pleaded for a second chance, saying he could fix the spreadsheets and make the toxic debt completely disappear if they just gave him one more week to work the numbers. It was the most pathetic, humiliating display I had ever witnessed in my entire life. The man who had spent 30 years looking down on me, the man who had proudly demanded that I bow to his superior social status, was now literally groveling on the floor, weeping like a completely broken child. Mr. Sterling pulled his expensive shoes away from Julian in utter disgust. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom suddenly swung open, and 4 large security guards in dark suits marched aggressively into the room. The chief executive officer pointed a shaking finger at Julian and ordered the guards to strip him of his corporate badge, his company phone, and his high-level security clearance. He explicitly told the guards not to let him pack up his office. He told them to throw him directly out onto the street like common garbage. 2 massive security guards grabbed Julian by his arms and violently hauled him up from the floor. They ripped the plastic security badge right off his lapel and dug roughly into his suit pockets to confiscate his encrypted company phone. Julian was sobbing uncontrollably, his expensive Italian leather shoes dragging across the polished floor as they pulled him away from the table. That is exactly when Sloane completely lost her mind. She had been sitting entirely frozen in her chair, watching the absolute destruction of her perfect, wealthy life. The terrifying reality of the financial clawback condition finally registered in her shallow brain. The bank was going to seize the money. The endless money she had used to buy her elite status, her fake friends, and her arrogant, racist confidence was completely gone. She leaped up from her chair and let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream. She ran toward Julian not to help him or comfort him, but to physically attack him. She started pounding her small fists aggressively against his chest while the large security guards held him tightly. She screamed that he was a disgusting liar and a completely worthless failure. She shrieked hysterically about the millions of dollars in debt they had just taken on for the massive Hamptons estate. She cried that her elite country club friends would completely shun her, and that she would genuinely rather die than be married to a poor, disgraced federal criminal. Julian reached his shaking hands out for her, crying her name over and over again, but Sloane violently spat directly in his face. She grabbed her expensive designer handbag and stormed blindly out of the glass boardroom, sobbing wildly about her ruined social reputation. She did not care for a single second that her husband was facing decades in a federal prison cell. She only cared that the golden faucet of stolen money had finally run completely dry. The security guards forcefully dragged Julian out the heavy doors, and his pathetic wailing echoed loudly down the long marble hallway until the elevator doors finally closed, cutting off his cries completely. The glass boardroom was suddenly quiet again. The air in the room felt completely different. The oppressive, toxic arrogance that had choked my family for 3 decades had been entirely eradicated in a matter of minutes. The emotional payoff was immense and deeply, incredibly satisfying. I had not raised my voice. I had not thrown a childish temper tantrum. I had simply used my brilliant mind and my relentless quiet work ethic to completely dismantle the vicious people who had tried to bury me. My parents were sitting frozen in their chairs, staring at the empty space where their golden child used to sit. My father, Reverend James, looked like a deflated balloon, all of his righteous religious anger completely replaced by absolute silent shock. My mother, Patricia, was weeping silently into her hands, mourning the devastating loss of the fake, perfect family image she had worshipped her entire life. I slowly reached across the mahogany table and pulled the manila folder back toward me, securing it safely inside my canvas backpack. I looked at the chief executive officer, nodded once, and turned my back on my toxic family forever. I had just taken my first step toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom when my mother violently grabbed my arm. Patricia was weeping so heavily that her expensive pearl necklace was shaking against her chest. She dug her manicured fingernails into the fabric of my coat and fell to her knees right there on the polished hardwood floor. She cried out, begging me to stop the security guards from taking her precious son away. She said, "Morgan, please, you have to fix this. You have the power to save him. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. God commands us to forgive our family." My father, Reverend James, rushed over and physically blocked the exit. His massive frame trembled as he looked down at me. He tried to summon that deep, booming preacher voice, but it just sounded broken and hollow. He told me that I was destroying the entire Evans family legacy. He said, "We are a Christian household, Morgan. We do not send our own family members to federal prison. You need to go back to Mr. Sterling and tell him to drop the charges right now. You owe us this much." I slowly looked down at my mother's hands gripping my arm. I calmly reached over and peeled her fingers off of me one by one. I did not feel an ounce of pity or sadness for them. I looked my father dead in the eyes, and I let the silence stretch out between us until he was forced to look away. I told them they did not get to weaponize religion and family blood only when it was convenient for them. I reminded my father of the exact words he had spoken to me at the anniversary dinner. I said, "You told me that Julian was the head of the family and the primary breadwinner. You proudly claimed he was carrying the heavy legacy of the Evans family on his back while I was a massive embarrassment to our good name." I reminded my mother of the cruel words she had screamed at me just a few days ago. I said, "You told me I needed to wire him $10 million to preserve the family blessing because my only purpose was to serve my brother." I stepped closer to my father, forcing him to step back against the glass door. I said, "You told me that if I did not give Julian half of my tech empire, I would be completely cut off from the only people in the world who truly loved me." I told him that I was finally taking his excellent advice. I officially accepted his terms. I told them they had spent 30 years worshipping a golden child who was nothing more than an arrogant criminal. They had sacrificed my childhood, my happiness, and their entire life savings to build a fake, perfect image that had just shattered into a million pieces. I told them I was absolutely done playing the role of the family scapegoat. The quiet, invisible girl who absorbed all of their toxic abuse was dead. I told them to never contact me again. I did not wait for their response. I pushed past. My father pushed open the heavy glass doors and walked out to the elevators. I left them standing entirely alone in the cold boardroom with the billionaire chief executive officer who was currently orchestrating their son's absolute ruin. The aftermath of that morning was incredibly fast and completely devastating for everyone who had tried to bury me. Just 2 weeks later, the major news networks interrupted their regular broadcasts with breaking financial updates. The Securities and Exchange Commission formally announced a massive federal indictment against Julian Evans. The news montages showed him doing the infamous perp walk out of a federal courthouse in heavy steel handcuffs, looking pale and completely terrified. His arrogant, smug smile was permanently erased. Vanguard Legacy Bank fully complied with the federal government to save their international trading licenses. They executed a ruthless corporate clawback, completely wiping out Julian's bank accounts, seizing his luxury vehicles, and legally voiding all of his unvested stock options. He was placed on the permanent Wall Street blacklist, completely destroying any chance of him ever working in finance again. The moment the bank seized their assets, Sloane proved exactly who she truly was. She did not stand by her man in his darkest hour. She immediately filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and extreme emotional distress. She packed her designer bags and moved back in with her wealthy parents, completely abandoning Julian before his very first criminal hearing. She made it abundantly clear to the media that she simply refused to be married to a poor, disgraced criminal. The public scandal was far too massive for my parents to hide. Their beloved church community, the same community they had sacrificed my well-being to impress, completely turned their backs on them. The congregation did not want to be associated with a massive federal fraud case. Desperate to pay for Julian's incredibly expensive federal defense attorneys, my parents were forced to quietly sell the historic Brooklyn brownstone. The very same house they had threatened to throw me out of was auctioned off to the highest bidder. My parents had to move into a tiny rented apartment in the suburbs, completely stripped of the high society status they had cherished more than their own daughter. While their entire world collapsed into dust, my world finally opened up to the bright, warm sun. I packed up my life in New York and completely relocated the headquarters of Nexus Artificial Intelligence to the sunny hills of Silicon Valley. My new corporate office has floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook sweeping green mountains. My loyal employees, the ones Julian tried to starve out, followed me across the country, and we are currently preparing to take the company public. I wake up every single morning feeling a profound, deep sense of peace that I never knew was possible. I am no longer carrying the heavy, suffocating weight of my toxic family. I do not look over my shoulder waiting for the next insult or the next manipulation. I am completely free. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire nightmare is that you do not owe your abuser's loyalty simply because you share the same DNA. Sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do for your own soul is to walk away from the table when love is no longer being served. You have to be willing to protect your peace with absolute ferocity, even if it means disappointing the people who brought you into this world. If you are watching this and you are currently the scapegoat in your own family, please know that your value is not determined by their inability to see your worth. Keep working hard in the dark. Keep building your empire out of the broken pieces they throw away. Your time will come, and when it does, do not let them take a single ounce of your light. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace? I would love to hear your personal stories and your victories in the comment section below. If my journey resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about resilience and overcoming family abuse. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that they are strong enough to break the cycle. Thank you so much for watching, And remember that your greatest success will always be your absolute best revenge.